Okay, I'd like to call the meeting to order, a council committee of the whole meeting for Wednesday, May the 29th at 3:30 p.m. We're a little late getting going. We have one agenda item, and it's a dandy in my mind. So we have a local government expert, Mr. George Cuff here, and I know he's the city manager, wants to introduce him. I asked him what kind of introduction he wants, and I think he's going to give us most of his history. So, city manager?
Thank you.
Oh, just one moment, please. I'm sorry. I forgot to do the land acknowledgement. Thank you. So before we start, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. The City of Medicine Hat acknowledges that we live and work on treaty territory. The city pays respect to all Indigenous peoples and honors their past, their present, and future. We recognize and respect their cultural heritage and relationships to the land. Thank you.
Through the chair, I just want to say I'm very pleased that George has made time in his very busy schedule. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. George Cuff.
Thank you very much. I just said the same thing to somebody else. I said, somebody said it's good to have you here. I said at my age it's good to be anywhere. But I'm thankful for the invitation. Just full disclosure, my wife is from Medicine Hat and has still some family members here that I've connected with over the years. And she grew up in Hilda, where her father was the postmaster. So we're actually out there, and I'm not sure what else you need to know in terms of my own connections, other than I would tell you that I was first retained by the City of Medicine Hat. I believe Ted Grimm was the mayor at the time, and tells you how far back that goes. And it was I was with a firm called Woods Gordon Clarkson Gordon, which evolved into Ernst & Young. It was the largest Canadian firm at the time, and we ended up doing, and I did it, all the work principally. I did a review of the purchasing department. I did a review of the HR department, as I recall, and I did a review, ironically, of the organization's structure, all of which I think I did in 1982. So your archivists are all going back to figure out where is those fantastic reports, all of which are now much dated and have cobwebs. In any case, I appreciate the fact that you've invited me. I'll spend a bit of time trying to share with you some of the, quote, wisdom that I might have picked up over the past 45 years. And I've got a brief introduction to go through, which I'll use if this system allows me to pop up. I just hit it once, is that correct? And did it work? It's not up. It's not up here yet. But don't let that stop me. I've spent time consulting, thank you. I've spent time consulting in all parts of Canada and other places in the world, most of which I've worked in is Canada, from one coast to the other, and done that for all 10 provinces, all 3 territories. Did work up in Iqaluit this past November, December. You'd think I was wiser than going up to Iqaluit in November, December, but in any case, I helped actually establish the city of Iqaluit. That's another unknown fact, but that was true. Back when it became Iqaluit, it used to be called Frobisher Bay. I have experience in a variety of other areas besides local government, but this has been my bread and butter for the 45 years that I've been doing consulting. I spent also, during that same time, I spent 12 years as mayor of Spruce Grove, just west of Edmonton, community of now about 45 or 40,000 people. Back then it was considerably smaller. 6 out of 7 of us were brand new as members of council, and I think was 29 years of age when I started, and I retired at the old age of 41. But again, as I said, I was still full-time consultant. I also spent time as president of, and on the board of AUMA in those days, now Alberta Munis, and became president. I think I'm their longest living past president. And I also spent a year as president of Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which was 1988-89. And to tell you how far back that is, one of the projects that we took on in those days was to open up China to the world. We must have done a pretty good job of that. But in any case, in fact, I remember doing a session on economic development in Shanghai. I don't think they need those now. I've been writing since the early or mid-70s, and I contribute articles and books to an organization called Municipal World. So if you want to do some further study on what I'm going to cover today, you can find that by looking at municipalworld.com. And I've written over 400 articles and 11 books. And good afternoon, Madam Mayor. I've also worked on 400 plus studies, not all the size of Chestermere, but 450 studies of municipalities and other organizations, including some not-for-profit organizations, including Crown agencies for the provincial government, including ones like the Alberta Gaming and Liquor Commission, including AMVIC, which is Alberta Motor Vehicle Industry Council, and a host of others. I've taught 700 seminars like this, 700 plus in my travels, and I call myself a student of good governance because all of us should still be learning as we go, and I certainly am still learning. I've also just wanted to bring you somewhat up to date, mainly to fill in some blanks for those that have never met or heard of me, and that would be a vast audience. I'm working presently on a governance audit for the district of Sechelt, which is north of Vancouver. I'm currently still employed doing some background advice. I helped establish a new governance model for Olds College, and they've retained me to provide some ongoing assistance. I recently did the review of the CAO, the Chief Administrative Officer for the town of Snowy Plain, and also for the city of West Kelowna in British Columbia. Both of those were within the last 3 months. I've done seminars across Western Canada, which I by and large limit myself to, other than when I do webinars, which I'm still doing. The city of Chestermere, most people have heard of that particular report. I was called in to do an inspection, and I don't think either the Assistant Deputy Minister or myself knew the scope that that would end up entailing, but I appreciated being called to do the review or the inspection. Acted as a governance advisor for the Municipal Police Commission in Edmonton, and I assisted MNP, which used to be Myers Norris Penny. I've done multiple podcasts, webinars, and code of conduct reviews in my spare time. In terms of purpose today, I'm going to spend a bit of time, I hope, briefing council on what I think is the essence of good governance. I want to talk about what results are expected if you're in fact functioning as you should be functioning. And by the way, I want to challenge all of you in terms of having you think through where are we at, what are we doing, what's CUF saying we should be doing, and are we following somewhere parallel to that. I never presumed that that's the case, and I haven't gone back and reviewed all of your files. I had some material sent to me, 3 binders full of background material that I had a chance that I asked for and had a chance to review, and I've since brought them back to you today. I'll provide you what I think are some of the key obstacles to good governance and why it works and why it doesn't. And I'll talk to you about what are some of the generic roles of the key roles called mayor, councillor, council, and CAO. And then perhaps talk about some steps forward. In terms of what is governance, this has been defined in a number of ways, so I thought I would take my own hand at it. Because nobody else had defined it in terms of local government. So I defined that in volume 1 of my 11 volumes. It'll be in my next one that I'm producing. They've asked me to take volumes 1 and 2 and collapse them, and so this will still be in there. It's the process of exercising corporate leadership by the policy-making body, which is you, on behalf of the public, to the organization as a whole in terms of purpose, control, future. So purpose would be the Municipal Government Act and a variety of other pieces of legislation. Control is established by the MGA. Control is established by your code of conduct. Control is established by your bylaws. Control is established by your policies. And future, which is by and large identified in terms of your strategic plan and other similar instruments. And also talks about overseeing the organization to ensure your mandate is achieved, and that's what council is, and one of its primary roles is to provide oversight. Governance represents decision-making processes utilized by the council in terms of determining the course for the future, the control of the present, and the recording of the past, and you're doing all of that at the same time. And governance can be done by bylaw, can be done by resolution, can be done by policy, which in actual fact, of course, is set by, it's set by bylaw and is set by resolution. So what governance is not, and unfortunately people stumble into this on a regular basis, which keeps me busy in doing this kind of work across Canada. So no matter how much I've preached this for the last 45 years, I'm obviously not very successful because people are still doing some of the same things. Governance is not the management of daily activities. It's not the implementation of policy. Council is the policy body. And so it bothers me to see something called managerial policy. I think that simply confuses the matter. I think what the managers run through should be called managerial directives. They should follow council policy. So if you're ever challenging what's happening in your organization, you should be able to have your management should be able to point to a particular governance policy that's an overarching policy under which you have managerial directives. That's how this should work. Whether it does or not is another question. After you make a policy decision, trying to find out or guide how it gets implemented is not governance. That's what you rely on your CAO or your city manager and good department heads to do, is to make sure that the policy decision by council is in fact actually implemented. And what it's not is providing detailed directions on how policies are to be done or implemented. It's not advising department heads and staff how to get it done, because that's part of the role of the city manager, CAO. It's not trying to get them to become your ally, your buddy, your friend. That to me is inappropriate. You need to have some degree of distance between yourselves and your management body. As I said to a variety of other seminars, and I probably need to repeat it here, is that council members lose their first name on election night. And I say that for good reason. I think there needs to be a measure of respect for the role of councillor. There's a measure of respect for the role of mayor, and I think that that shows up when people around this table, the administrative side, refer to those that they report to by the appropriate title. Some of you may not appreciate that, but that's, I think, how the world should work. We need to make sure we understand roles rather than we're all in this together. Yeah, we know that, but we also have separate roles. Governance is not showing up at work sites to see what happens after you make a decision the night before. If you do that, by the way, show up with two things in hand. One's a bucket of coffee and the other's a pile of donuts, and you just drop those off and carry on and say thank you very much for the good work you're doing and try not to stay any longer than that takes. Governance is not advising people on social media how they can attack council decisions, which I obviously think is totally inappropriate for a member of council, which unfortunately has happened in organizations that I've been brought in to review. And so you've got councillors who are actually acting in opposition to their own body by fighting from within. What is meant by good governance in a city council environment? You need to have a council that understands it was elected to govern. And one of the challenges of that, I will, by the way, stray from my text from time to time. One of the challenges of that is that the people that get elected around this table come out of backgrounds called work backgrounds for the most part, and whether that's running a home or whether that's running a local business or whether that's teaching or whether that's being the ophthalmologist or whatever it happens to be, you come out of a, quote, work background, and then you come into the council chambers and you're immediately told that your work background might have informed you, but it isn't local government, and your role has changed dramatically. You've gone from being an administrator, boss, manager, whatever you're called in your normal day-to-day work, and you're now expected to be a governor. So how does that shift? How does that change? And that's one of the challenges I think council members run into. You got to be willing to learn those new roles, which I think applies to all. And I said this at countless seminars because people get reelected, and I say people that are reelected should consider themselves brand new because nobody has served other than you on the 2021-2025 council before. And if you run and get reelected, you ought to be back to an orientation session to again learn the roles, and if nothing else, to encourage the new people that are sitting next to you. Good governance means you abide by the legislation. That's the law. It's the fundamentals. It's whether we like it or not, and there are some things that I've argued with over the years, and I've actually made a bit of an adjustment, a change. I think have had some impact. So, for example, councils are required to do a performance review. That wasn't always the case. Councils are required to do an orientation. That wasn't always the case. And so if you argue long enough and make a strong enough argument, some of your recommended changes might happen. But until they happen, you follow the law. In most cases, it's called, for municipalities, the Municipal Government Act, it's called other things in other provinces, Community Charter in BC, but by and large, it's the same legislation, which, by the way, Alberta sets the standard for the most part. So you go right across Canada, you'll find legislation governing the municipalities. By and large, it's based on Alberta's legislation, and they admit to that. Alberta has reasonably sound legislation, except I still think there's adjustments to be made. Good governance means that council abides by that you abide by your own bylaws, which is yours. Those are your bylaws. Again, whether you vote 5-4 or 7-2 or 9-0, they're still your bylaws if we all accept democracy, which most people do until the vote goes against them. And policies, of course, are a reflection of what we do. So council's in the business of what, and management should be in the business of how. So council should be saying, here's what we do in this particular instance. Your management should be in the business of talking about, and here's how we're going to get it done so that we follow the tone, we follow the intent of council's decisions and directions. Council's governance means being prepared to set aside personal disputes and focus on what's best for the community. So again, I can tell you that I'm working on issues today, which happens virtually every month of the year when I'm involved in local government, with councils that have members on it that can't stand each other, do everything they can to avoid each other, or when they do get together, they take shots at each other sitting at the council table, all of which is totally inappropriate, all of which is immature, and unfortunately it happens. And often when it happens, I get called in to try to help put out the fire. Good governance means that you understand and accept that all the decisions in the chambers are yours, regardless. You know, at the end of the day, you can say, well, I voted against that, but the average public really doesn't care about that. They say the City of Medicine Hat Council decided da-da-da-da-da, and you might be the ones that go and check to see who actually voted what. But at the end of the day, it's a council decision, and people presume it's a council decision. Very few people would say, oh, I see you voted against that. You might have one or two of your friends would do that, but by and large, the average public says, no, that's a city council decision. Good governance means that you respect the CAO, in this case, her roles. You understand she's accountable to council as a whole. I'll talk about this a little bit later on in terms of her liaison and linkage and so on, but council needs to understand that the CAO reports to all of you. And to the extent possible, the CAO should deal with all of you as co-equals, recognizing that the mayor is a bit more co-equal than the rest of you. And I'll talk about that. Good governance means that you accept the one employee principle. So the one employee principle is fairly standard, I hate to say this, right across Canada. It's adopted in, I think, virtually now every province across Canada and every territory. It's also adopted in every Crown agency that I've ever reviewed. They're called chief executive officers. Here we call them a CAO or a city manager. The titles are interchangeable. So you have one CEO for virtually every Crown corporation, including the biggest ones that Alberta has, which, for example, would be Alberta Gaming and Liquor Commission. I was astounded by how much revenue it brings in. I think when I did the review, it was number 2 in terms of the revenue stream for the province, with number 1 being the oil and gas industry. You need to be committed to an annual assessment of the CAO. So that has not always been the case. I've been involved in communities where they never do a review. I remember doing the review in Bathurst 100 years ago, and I asked the head of Public Works, how long have you worked here? And he said, 33 years. And I said, well, that's amazing. He said, when was your last performance review? And he said, 32 and a half years ago. True story. I don't remember these things unless they really strike me as odd or outstanding. That was outstanding. So it's sad when you think about it. So councils have one employee. They need to sit down annually at minimum with their one employee and do what's called a performance assessment. And there are a couple of models for doing that, one of which is produced by the Canadian Association of Municipal Administrators. I have a lot of respect for the organization. I just happen to think that their model is overly complex and convoluted and covers things that you would not have very much idea about. We have a CUF model that I developed some years ago that I fine-tuned until I got asked by a couple of communities this year, and I took another look at it, and I thought, you know, it's interesting. We often look at these performance reviews kind of as just a standard template. Let's go through, fill in the blanks and so on. And I did that, and I thought, what am I actually doing here? And I remember being hired by the Office of the Auditor General of Alberta to do a review of how CEOs were recruited, how they were assessed, and how they were paid. And this goes back some years, but I remember doing that review, and I remember walking into the then chair of the Board of Governors, University of Alberta, and he had all this big map under glass on this main conference table. And he said, George, I know that's what you're here for, but here's our overall assessment of our president. And I thought, well, that looks impressive. But I did a little bit of homework before I got there and found out that the chair had been involved as a chair in another organization that had recently gone through firing their CEO. And so I asked the chair, I said, so tell me, which one of these multitude of criteria did you use when you fired the CEO? And he looked at it and looked at me and smiled and he said, none of them. I said, you're right. So what did you look at? You looked at trust, confidence, respect. And if those three aren't visible to you in your organization, I can tell you, you can go through all the charts you want, all the indices, you can score them all average, plus, minus, whatever, I don't care. At the end of the day, I've had people do that, and they still, it's like the hockey coach being asked, do you have, or the general manager, do you have confidence in the coach? Oh, yes, absolutely. And 2 days later, the person's fired, and you're thinking, what happened? Well, it's because they didn't have confidence, they didn't have trust, they didn't have respect, and they didn't have results. What is meant by good governance? Council focuses on the establishment of clear policies. So you've been at it since October of 2021, it strikes me. I would, if I was doing what I call a governance audit of the city, one of the questions I'd be asking would be, so what policies have you changed? Have you brought to council as new? What's changed since you came into office? You ran for office. Some of you ran because you didn't like the policies of the last council. So I want to know which ones did you recommend get changed. I want to see your name on something. I want to know that the CAO and senior managers have brought to you policy changes or new policy, because this is supposed to be a policy governance body. Unfortunately, what happens is you get involved in reviewing and looking at individual disputes and all kinds of managerial activity and so on, and you lose sight of what it is you should be doing as a council, which is to set policy. You want to control the organization? You want to control what all your senior management do? You set good policy. And if you're setting good policy, they're setting good managerial directives, and you're in charge. But if you don't do that, you're simply saying to the CAO and senior management, go for it. And you hope and pray that they're doing the right thing, and given the fact that they're professional, I'm going to presume that they are. But where's the policy control by you and your council? Just a question and an offhand remark, obviously. Determines to engage with your public regularly. Well, part of the things you're required to do, and one of the changes to the Municipal Government Act in the last 5 years, I think, was the requirement to do public engagement, to establish a public engagement policy. So what follows policy? Well, you'd think you're probably going to have a public engagement strategy and a public engagement set of goals and objectives and so on, and I'd presume that you have that. So again, if I was looking at the organization, I'd be asking to see, besides this policy on public engagement, what have you done with that? It discusses, council discusses its vision for the city and agrees on a set of strategic priorities. You know, at one time I used to do I know I don't want to dump on people that do strategic planning, by the way, because there are some very good people out there that do very good work. I just realize as I get old and aged and archaic that, you know, the time spent on strategic planning in my mind is often ill spent. Because you're diving as a deep dive into all kinds of detail that I think are totally unnecessary, if in actual fact you haven't said, here's the 5 or 10 key things we want to get done in this term. So I would be asking, where's your one-pager that says, here's what I want to get done? Because that's what I would like to focus on. The rest of the stuff, because neither here nor there, kind of comes and goes, I would expect to see your management fill in those blanks and bring it up to you and say, is this what you're looking for? And you'd be able to say, yeah, you're right on target. Instead of that, I review, again, consulting reports. It sounds like I'm dumping on my brethren. And I just received a Lifetime Achievement Award on Saturday from the Canadian Association of Management Consultants. I should be careful with what I'm saying. But in any case, I see these really nice strategic plans, and I can tell that council virtually had nothing to do with it. There's somebody that was a really good writer put it all together and put nice pictures in it and all that kind of stuff. And I'm thinking, so where's the council's brand on this? Where's your label on this? And I think that's critical in terms of you as a council. Reviews all the reports from the CAO and your senior management team carefully. And you're, as a council, one of the things, the guru of management consulting was a guy by the name of Peter Drucker. There are all kinds of stuff written by him. Some of it is extremely profound, so you find yourself reading it 2 or 3 times, unlike my material. And you look at the stuff that he's written. One of the quotes that came out of him was, there's nothing more useless in life than doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. And unfortunately, that's often what we do. We take a look at organizations, we look at what they're doing, and the other quote he said is, there's no such thing as a dumb question, except the one not asked. And so I would encourage council members, don't sit at a council meeting and have a report that you're not entirely sure where this is going, you're not entirely sure the basis of it, the management's used words that you've never seen before, and you're sitting there being expected to put your hand up and vote in favor. I'm not in that school. I'm in the school that says you ought to feel comfortable asking questions. You ought to feel comfortable challenging an answer, but doing so, obviously, respectfully. Good governance means giving your colleagues the benefit of the doubt. You question ideas, you question statements. You stay away from character assassination. You address the issues, not the faces. So what goes wrong with councils is they become personality focused, and they start looking across the table, in your case around the horseshoe, and you start taking shots at each other rather than the point that the person made. And what you ought to be doing is listening carefully to the point being made and say, do I agree with that? And if I don't agree with it, what do I agree with? What if I was going to propose something different, what is that? It's one thing to say I'm opposed, but what are you opposed to? And spare it later on, because some of the best discussions, of course, are held in parking lots and boardrooms after the fact, where they do no good whatsoever. So you need to be saying what you need to say here, and you need to say it in a way that lands well rather than lands on the face. You're willing to admit when wrong, and all of us should be willing to do that, because we err regardless of how old we get, which I can share with you from my perspective. You need to be thankful for the views of others. I mean, I think it's a great blessing to have 8 people around the table in support of the mayor's position, to be able to challenge the mayor can challenge you. All of that should be able to go on. You should be able to have a really good discussion around roles, around how are we filling those roles, all of that. Does not seek unanimity. I think having 9-0 votes are badly overrated. I would take any major issue on your agenda, I would walk it down Main Street or Riverside Drive or whatever this is called that I just drove along your lovely roadway out here that I recall Dr. Ken Sauer living on, if I remember correctly. I would walk it down that street and find 10 people, and I would say to them, here's the issue and here's the background, how would you vote? And I'll guarantee you I'm not going to get 9-0. You ought to have 9-0 when it's time to open the meeting and when it's time to go home. Between that and that, you ought to be able to have votes that are 5-4, 7-2, and it doesn't matter. The day I left office after 12 years, I challenged somebody. I said, well, somebody said, you know, you had a great term, a great role as a mayor, great term. Did you ever lose a vote? I said, oh, yeah. I lost several. And I didn't lose a lot, but I lost several votes. They said, don't you remember them? They said, no. I said, I'll tell you why. Because the moment I lost it, I moved to the next item. Why is that? Because I trusted the fact that I had 6 other colleagues with me and we all voted. It's called democracy. So I lost. Who cares? Who's going to know? Council decided. You're willing to admit when wrong, thankful for the views of others, don't seek unanimity, and you preach democracy, which says 5 beats 4. That's a simple fact of democracy. What's meant by quality management? You need to be aware of best practices, and from a council perspective, I'll talk about that, but management needs to know what is best practice in terms of good management. I have a session with your managers tomorrow morning from 8 till 10. I plan to talk to them about some of this. You adhere to the approved organization structure. I'm going to stop there because it's something that strikes me that this council might be faced with, and I think most organizations I deal with are faced with the same issue. And so when I do a governance audit, in the old days called a corporate review, which I know I did here 100 years ago, I would ask you to send me a variety of documents, one of which is the org structure, one of which is the minutes of a variety of meetings, which I pick so you can't cherry pick them. And same with the agenda packages. I say, here's the dates I want the agenda package for. And then I look through the agenda package, and beside that I have with me on my table the org structure of the city. So I look at the agenda package and it says, here's a report it says to the mayor and council from the managing director, Dennis Eggert, is that right? From managing director Dennis Eggert. I stopped there for a moment. I think, well, that's odd. Well, why is that odd? Well, he doesn't report to the mayor and council. He reports to this lady sitting over here called city manager. So if you want to give council the wrong impression, you'll have all of your managers reporting directly to you, which they did, by the way, in 1982. But I thought you had changed that model. So your managers, because they have a great degree of respect for your city manager, would report to her and through her to council. Does that mean that everything comes through the city manager? Well, that's the way the model's set up. Does that mean she's the only person speaking at a council meeting? No, that's not true. You would say through the chair to the city manager or CAO. Which one do you use? City manager. So you have an archaic name to it. But in any case, you go through the city manager, and the city manager should say, thank you very much, Madam Mayor or Mr. Chair, and now I'll refer you over to our managing director of. What does that do? Well, it shows that there's a flow through. This person has ultimate control managerially, and this person is your management, your subject matter expert. That's what that says. Anyway, I don't want to get stalled on a particular point because I'm sure you're doing all the right things. Understanding as to why that's important, I mean, if you know that this has an impact on structure, it has an impact on flow, it has an impact on respect, then you follow some basic principles. You have departments with clear mandates. You've got a series of those. You've got a series of the functions that the managing directors are responsible for. You lay that out often during an orientation. I would be very careful during the orientation if I was a management, because I would be laying out, here's what the managing directors are responsible for, and council deals with the CAO or city manager and the managing directors. And here's the functions they're responsible for, and there's a whole series of functions below that. But the last thing you do is give the council the organization structure or wiring diagram. You might as well hand out the phone numbers, because that's what you're in fact trying to do. So you ought not to be doing that. You ought to be saying these people are accountable to this person and they're going to run the overall city. So let's make sure that they're being held to account. At least that's what should happen. Collaborative leadership says these people work together. Do they all get along? I have no idea. They might tell me tomorrow, but I presume that they get along well enough to work together. They aren't all real close. They're typically somebody's closer to somebody else than others. It doesn't really matter as long as they collaborate at a management table. That's what you want to hear about. They focus on the priorities. They're the ones that would recommend that we need to go through this process. They might even recommend who you bring in as a facilitator, but they're the ones that help make sure that your priorities are being followed up, so you don't have to start scrambling at the 11th month of a 12-month year when you're trying to put together your report on strategic priorities, and you're trying now to figure out which ones do we actually look after. You need to have a sound, realistic business plan which flows from a strategic plan. And you should have planned mentoring. Planned mentoring says that in every organization, the senior management realizes that one of their roles, as the role for Ms. Mitchell would be as the CAO, would be that she would be guiding and directing her managing directors so that when she went on holidays, any one of those could replace her. I'm totally opposed, by the way, to an assistant city manager. I think that convolutes the process. I think it changes the overall, anyway, I could go into all kinds of chapters on that. You need to have, you've got 3 or 4 managing directors, I think 4. Any one of those could replace. And if you went on a 4-week holiday, you give one week, one the next week, one the next week. That way they all keep each other honest and accountable, and they all work together in a collaborative form. At least that's how it's expected to work. You should have clearly understand parameters, clearly understand policies that they function within, as I talked about earlier. You need to have sound recruitment. So, I mean, I used to do executive recruitment back in the old days, and I think I did close to 100 recruitments of senior managers in local governments. And I got out of that business because I realized it was becoming more and more of a specialty, and I wanted to do more of what I'm doing today, which is more organization reviews and more seminars. But does that mean that I still don't know people? No, the answer is I got called on the way down here today by at least one person, a counselor, who's a deputy Reeve, saying, George, who do you know? And they know I don't do recruitment, but they know that I bump into a lot of people. And so I gave a couple of your managing directors' names and said you should phone them because they'll be good for you to recruit. But that's how that happens, because recruitment firms know that you don't stick an ad in the paper and hope for the best. That's ridiculous. They go out and do what's called headhunting, and they find quality people, and your managers will be not unlike right across this country. They'll get a call every 2 or 3 or months or weeks asking, are you interested? And, depending on your relationship to them will depend on whether or not that particular day they show any interest. Effective monitored communication. Do we respect each other? Do we communicate effectively? Do we communicate well internally? Do we communicate well down the organization? Do we communicate well to our council members? And do we do so respectfully? We focus on integrated service delivery. Again, that's sort of a process of collaboration. We desire to serve people effectively, responsibly, and we have what's called a program of planned training and development. Rather than simply chasing off to particular courses, we make sure that we know what the budget is that's established for city managers, established for the department heads, and down the organization, and we make sure that our people are going to courses that make sense for their particular role, or at least they should. Recognition of the importance of accountability. At the end of the day, there's a whole variety of things that these managing directors are accountable for, and I'm sure that that's the discussion they would have with the CIO when their performance review comes up. Senior leaders who exhibit integrity, who you can take the money to the bank and know that it's fine, that you know you've got people that you trust, because that's the quickest way out the door in terms of senior management, is when trust is broken. Typically, I used to use a variety of other terms to describe it, but I won't. Once the trust is broken, it's typically done, and it's very, very hard to recover. You need senior leaders who accept authority, who discharge it wisely, and who try not to jump the traces and get involved in somebody else's role, including council. Communication of shared values, clearly define managerial directives which are passed down the organization. And you need a sense of action orientation if this is going to work. So the system itself works well when the city offers a pre-election seminar called So You're Thinking of Running for Office. So I just had this discussion. I fell into a podcast with a colleague of mine who used to be the managing director of KPMG, and he's probably 10 or 15 years my senior, believe it or not, but he's still involved in providing advice, but now non-paid for. But a brilliant mind, and he ended up doing something on local government on what were the key challenges, and we ended up outlining 10 key challenges, had those rated across Alberta by cities, towns, villages, counties, municipal districts, and outlined what those were, and then we said we would take them further, and we ended up meeting with the president of Alberta Munis. Virtually, we met with the president of rural municipalities the other day, and we're meeting with the deputy minister of municipal affairs, who ironically was one of my students at one time in the local government intern program. But in any case, we talked to them about what are the key issues, one of which was we need to catch people before they get into office, and we need to explain roles. And I am absolutely sold on that. We need to make sure people that are thinking of running for office, you folks should host a whole regional session for people up in the gallery that think, well, I wouldn't mind running for council. I wonder what that means. What does it mean in terms of hours? What does it mean in terms of responsibility? Do I get free parking? Do I get a free lunch? Do I get to go to a course out of town? Do I get to go to Halifax for a convention? What does all of this mean? Well, I think it'd be worthwhile for you folks to be offering a really first-class regional session 8 weeks before an election to say, so you're thinking you might run for office? Well, let me tell you what it's all about. And maybe one or two of you speak at it. The mayor hosts it and draws people together, all of that. That's what should happen. What happens? People get into office, and then it's bang. And everything comes at them at the same time, and it's the old line about drinking water from the fire hose because you're getting hit with so many documents. And anyway, I think that system helps. Your system will work well if you've got people coming in who understand what authority do I have, what power do I have individually, what authority do we have collectively, how is that offered in our community? How do we work together? How are we supposed to work together? Are we supposed to vote together? Are we supposed to all be on the same page? By the way, I'll get back to that. I think your vote should be, by and large, unanimous around the strategic priorities. And I say that because by the time you get to the final vote, you've already gone through a day or two's sessions, and you kind of whittled off the ones that don't make as much sense, and you kind of all come to an agreement on here's the top 5 or 10. You may end up being unanimous on that. There's nothing particular wrong with that. Legislation is understood as a rule of law. You might want to oppose it, but the fact of the matter is it's still the rule of law. And so that applies to me, it applies to everyone around this table. Role definitions in the legislation are understood and they're described broadly, which is why people like me write about what do they actually mean. What's the generic discussion or description of that role versus what does that state categorically in section 207 or what, give me a title and that's, you've got a section there that outlines what the roles are. There's a role in the role of the mayor, role of councillor, and so on, role of the CAO. An orientation on good governance has been held within 30 days. So I remember doing one here 2016 or 17, after the election would have been 2017, down at the golf club. And you had Cypress, no, was it Cypress? You had Cypress, you had Redcliffe, you had Medicine Hat, and you also had a blizzard. And I remember getting into the blizzard as I drove out of there, the first time I've ever seen one in Medicine Hat, because you're always dry. And I got on the highway and they're stopping all the vehicles on the highway because there's a big accident ahead of us. Anyway, that was, I think, 2017. I think Moretta, I think, was the CAO at the time. Orientation on good governance. Why is that important? Well, it's 'cause people get to ask some questions. They've now been at it for a week or two maybe. They got sworn in. Let's have some questions about what does all this mean? Why did I get appointed to this variety of boards and committees, and why don't I know anything about them? Given the fact that they've existed for 30 or 50 years in Medicine Hat, why would there not be a one-pager written up on every one of these? Well, I don't know, somebody dropped the ball and they forgot to do that. They thought you'd know by the name of the title. No, that's not good enough. All council members are welcome to elected office. I don't think we do that as well here as they do that in some other places. And I was, again, I did a seminar for West Kelowna before they hired me to do other things. And I saw them getting marched in with the RCMP and the pipes and drums, and they had a nice evening of wine and cheese together and the whole works. I thought it was a really class act. That's how they got sworn into office. And I thought, and their meeting was the next day or whatever. I thought, I just recall us kind of walking in and a judge gave us the Bible, we put our hand on it and swore to being a good person. All council members are sworn in, provided some background material, and then it comes at you with this deluge of material as opposed to, one of the jobs of senior management, by the way, is to manage information. And that's why I'm opposed to massive agenda packages. I think it's just a reflection of poor management. I'll probably say that tomorrow, and I'll probably have a hard time getting into my car because I'll be beat up so much by the time I get there. But in any case, I remember doing work for City of St. Albert and asked them to send me the agenda package for a variety of meetings. I got one that was sent to me. It was 904 pages. And I said to the city manager, I said, I'd fire the clerk. Anyway, the clerk was standing right next. I said it facetiously. I'm not sure they took it that way because I sometimes seem more serious than I might be. Any case, 904 pages. Did you all run realizing you were going to read more stuff than you've ever read in your lives, and you're supposed to know all of this stuff? System works well when you recognize there's a lot to learn. All understand that their personal backgrounds had virtually nothing to do with getting elected. I wish people would figure that one out. But I was a management consultant the whole time, and by the time I left, I had people saying to me 10, 15, 20 years later, so what are you doing now? And I'd say the same thing I did then. And they say, yeah, but you're no longer the mayor. I say, well, that's true, but did you think you paid me enough to be just the mayor? Oh, what were you doing? So I was a management consultant. Oh, what did you consult on? My name is in the local newspapers, in the Edmonton Journal on a variety of reports. They could care less. They probably didn't realize that was me. Why would they want me for? They wanted me to be passionate about the city. They wanted me to be involved in making sure that we're providing good governance. They wanted me at least to be clear thinking. Did they ask each person, what do you do for background? They wouldn't have a clue. You go up and down Main Street and ask the question, do you know what I do for work? Who cares? They want you to make good decisions when you get here, and they want you to love the city and the future of it. You see each other as co-equals. You respect the fact that the mayor's a bit more co-equal by virtue of your legislation. You don't have to read that once. You can figure that out. It says there are certain additional duties to being the mayor. By and large, it's called a weak mayor system in Canada. It's also, by and large, a weak mayor system in the States. So it's a misnomer to say that it's a strong mayor system. It is for certain municipalities, but by and large, because I've taught down there for years, it's also a weak mayor system. They rely on collaboration. They rely on people making decisions together. They rely on the mayor working with the council, unlike what you're now probably going to find in Ontario. All have utmost respect for each other. If it's working well, you don't carry forward griefs and complaints. You don't take that forward from one term to the other. You make sure that you draw a line at the end of each meeting and you say hello to each other and you shoot the breeze and you ask about how the family's doing and you talk about how great the Oilers are. Sorry. System works well when everyone is viewed as being interested in nothing but the best for this city. It's a fundamental. I'm in this role as a councillor because I want the best for the city. And ironically, everybody around this table wants the same. They just happen to see the best somewhat differently. And we got to get our heads around that. No one's faulted if they happen to back other candidates. I mean, I had this discussion with the mayor of another community yesterday who's saying about how terrible it was when they went to the opening reception, and here's 3 of the candidates that got elected coming in with the ex-mayor who got beat. I think, so what? I don't care. You're the new mayor. Get that into your head and you'll be fine. Doesn't matter. I don't care who people support. Everybody get a free shot at it. If you're management, hide. Don't show up. Don't be around during election season. Go on holidays. Come the day time to vote and come the time when it's ready to swear people in. And if you get any signs, don't put them on your lawn. If you do, use it for aeration and make sure that you got 14 signs for every person running. Anyway, just to me, it's you stay out, management stays out of politics. All recognize how blessed the city is to have a good senior management team. All respect the role of the CAO. You agree to abide by its prerogatives. Why? Because you have a bylaw. CAO role is established by bylaw. It says here's what the CAO is expected to do. You've got something to hang your hat on, and you've got something to hang the CAO with. You can say these are the requirements of the job. All agree to channel your questions through the CAO. Don't play silly games with other staff. Don't get people on my side versus your side. All of that kind of stuff. System works well when the mayor understands and accepts that she was elected, not appointed, not anointed. She's elected to be a representative of all the city. And again, it's not the citizens that voted for her in this case, it's for all the community. Mayor understands and accepts that the CAO is appointed by council to manage the city. The mayor understands and accepts that the CAO reports to all of council. System works well when the mayor understands and accepts that the CAO's contract was signed, which outlines the expectations. It outlines when you're going to do the review next. It outlines the term of the contract typically. It outlines the fact that there's a sunset clause typically. It outlines what you're going to pay the person to be the city manager. And it also happens to align with your provisions which are in section 207, 208, and as most of you would know, you're not expected to know all of these sections nor everything that's in them. There's probably, I don't know, 10 or 15 sections of the Act that I'd recommend you take a good look at. The rest of the 710 sections, you can rely on the clerk's office and some other eager beaver that's at senior management levels perhaps, or junior management levels, that they're going to know what the rest of the Act actually says. That's important, but is it important that you know all that stuff? No, not really. It's important you know your own role. It's important you know how your relationship should be with management. It's important that you respect the people sitting next to you. And I would, by the way, greatly in favor of relocating where you're sitting on an annual basis so that you get used to talking to somebody else on either side of you. The only person staying the same in most normal situations would be the mayor. The rest, everybody else moves. That way you also get fresh gum. So the role, however, will be handicapped if the mayor believes that she was the only leader elected in the last election, and thus the only voice that citizens ought to hear. And again, this is really applying it just locally. This is what I would say right across Canada. Mayor has to reflect voices. Mayor's a tough role. You expect the mayor to stand up at the end of a meeting and say, we as council decided. And the media could say, yeah, but you voted against it. It doesn't matter. We as our council decided. I'm the voice of council. It does say it's handicapped where the mayor disregards the value that other elected people bring to the table. You all bring your own opinions, you all bring your own values, and hopefully your own ideas, and we can meld and amalgamate that. Mayor believes that she has ultimate authority over the CAO. Again, that doesn't work. What works is the fact that the CAO reports to council as a whole. So when you do a performance review in the old days, they would actually have the mayor sit down with the CAO and do a performance review. And people like me said that doesn't make sense. If it did, the CAO would be paying the total salary for the CAO. And if you want to do that as the mayor, go ahead. But in actual fact, that's a shared cost by the community, and so we as the community representatives get to hire the CAO, all 9 of you, not a committee, all 9 of you, and all 9 of you ought to be involved in the performance review. You have a closer relationship if you're the mayor. You meet independently with members of cabinet and present views which may or may not align with the council. That's not a role for the mayor because the mayor is voicing the decisions of this council. And I just got off the phone yesterday with a mayor who challenged me on this particular role because this particular mayor is used to going and meeting with cabinet, who he knew for other hats that he had on, and da-da-da-da-da. I say, yeah, but you've got to be representing the community. We're not representing yourself. There's a big difference. And if the mayor hears only their supporters on council, then the mayor doesn't hear the broad swath of the community. And that means you go to a whole bunch of events. So I turned on your system and listened to your event that the mayor was at, along with former Alderman Ken Sauer, along with other people who were at, I think, the Rotary Club or Kinsman Club, and there was a nice function, and the mayor gave a State of the City address. Well, the mayor meets all kinds of folks. Did everybody vote for her? Who cares? You get another chance in another couple of years to decide again. Roles handicap, where the mayor treats the CAO disrespectfully, undermines the clout that the position should bring to the organization. Why is that important? Because you as an organization want the organization to respect upwards. That's why that's important. If the CAO says, we got to do this, the rest of the organization jumps to the pumps. Attempts to speak to or befriend other members of administration in case they're in a position to help the mayor move forward with their agenda. And again, it's tempting. That is not helpful. What's helpful is for you to get across your point of view as mayor, as councillors at this table. Tries to stall items from being placed on the agenda. So one of the notions that I came up with some years ago is to create what's called an agendas committee. So I would put on the committee the mayor, the deputy mayor, the CAO, the clerk. And I would say everything come to council should go through an agendas committee. And then I had another model called a governance and priorities committee rather than committee of the whole, which I think is badly used. And I would have people that would sit on that agendas committee that would decide what are the top 4 big items that we want to move over to the governance priorities committee so we have a chance to look at what's important. Well, the mayor should be involved in that. The mayor and the deputy mayor. What should you do? You should rotate deputy mayors every so often so you get a fresh face and a fresh voice, and nobody's allowed to stop items going forward to council. So there's a terms of reference to it. Well, that applies to the mayor, applies to other members of council. What does success look like? Success looks like with council understood its roles, understood what the community expected from it as a council. You'd have this nailed if you could figure that one out. Does everybody do that? No, not really. So I got council members, they get elected and they quit going to the farmer's market. Why do you do that? Well, we had too many people stop, myself and my significant other, and they would bother me while I was going to the farmer. I think, geez, you just got elected. No wonder they're going to bother you. They're going to ask you a question. So what? Carry on. You visit the farmers markets twice as long. You get to meet more people. And they realize you've got clout and they don't. That's what happens on election night. You go from being citizen to mayor or citizen to councillor. Everybody around your neighborhood knows who you are. You may not think so. So I'm doing work for Alberta Health, and I did a review of all these regional health authorities, one of which was Lakeland, where the former Premier Ed Stelmach was resident. And I did a massive review for them under the then Minister Halvor Johnson. And they invite me to the legislature, or not legislature, invite me to Government House, which is where the old museum was. And they take me into a side office and say, the minister is busy, but he'll be down shortly. So then the EA comes in to see, make sure I'm still alive. And I say to the EA, he said, so what do you do? And da-da-da-da-da. And I said, so where do you live? No, I said, are you married? He said, yeah. I said, well, where does your significant other work? And he said, well, she works for Lac-Saint-Anne County School Division. I said, well, that's out west of me. And I said, you're working downtown, so where do you live? He said, we live across the street from you. Anyway, they moved in the wintertime, so I have some excuse as to why I hadn't met him yet. But it was a sort of a point around, not everybody knows, but they know who I am. I don't know who they are, but they get told who's in their community. People up and down your street will be told, we've got a councillor living on our block. We've got the mayor just living down the road from us. All of that becomes important to them more than you think, and will carry on, by the way, after you've left office. Council's impact in terms of success was seen in terms of the direction you set, not the direction set by your management. I thought this was a role of council to represent the community. Management does a wonderful job setting the direction within these umbrellas. So you ought to be able to identify 5 or 8 key umbrella areas that you want to see progress, and they're going to be able to show you how they're going to make that happen. Council establishes a limited number of goals and targets so that you're not swamped by those and trying to keep track of them all and say, no, that doesn't make sense. You ought not to become bookkeepers while you're trying to be council members. You've got enough stuff to look at. Council members, the mayor and council were aware of and confident in their roles, confident in their relationships. It takes time. I could do this seminar within 2 weeks of you getting elected, and a month later you're saying, geez, what did that guy say? Because everything comes at you. So I now do it every 2 years I get called in by communities. In fact, just going back to do one in Abbotsford next week or the week after, where it's kind of the 2-year check-in, George, come back and give us a refresh. Roles and powers of the CAO were fully explained, fully understood. That ought to be a part of this fundamental orientation. City managers, sorry. Council management perceived as singing from the same song sheet because you're working together on behalf of the community. Do you agree on everything? Absolutely not. Do you agree on the big pieces? Yeah, I hope so. Why? Because you would have worked those through. You'd have looked at them as management. You'd have looked at them as council. You'd have had a respectful dialogue and a respectful conversation. Do you all get to vote on what's a priority and what isn't? I hope not, because that's a defiance of democracy. You're the ones that got elected. So we've got to figure out what are the key priorities for this council. What would success look like when council members showed respect for the opinions and decisions of their colleagues? I don't want people sort of feeling distant from whoever's sitting next to you because they voted against you. Or you came off with this great soliloquy of why somebody ought to support whatever, and the person next to you says the exact opposite, and you look at them thinking, where did you come from? Well, the answer is they came from Medicine Hat. They came from the same community. They just happened to be schooled differently, socialized differently, different values, go to church differently, whatever, and they think differently. Management becomes more professional each day. They continue to up their serve as senior management, which I'm sure they're trying to do. Your public sees council doing its best. It's open to the public. Does that look messy? It's the old joke about anybody that likes the sausage should never watch any being made. Well, it's true. You know, it's sometimes a delicate role of being on council. You're getting involved in all kinds of stuff, but eventually this good stuff comes out the other end. Mayor becomes stronger, more confident as an advocate for the city. And again, that's a collective, collegial role that's epitomized by the person at the head of it. What are the impediments? Inadequate understanding of those roles. Think you know it, and then you run into something and say, why are we in this? That's always a good question, by the way. 2 real good questions. What's our policy here, and why are we involved in this? And you know, when you ask the why are we involved in this, it may well be that your city manager has already got that in her bylaw. So why is it coming to you? I mean, how many times does the green light go on? I would ask the question around budget. If we've already approved this in budget, why are you coming back and saying, may I? Eventually, we'll turn on the red light. Council members interjecting themselves into administrivia, that's an impediment. Get yourself involved in, oh, that's interesting. And you start diving into somebody's department. Yeah, I'm sure it is interesting. That's why you've got quality people heading them up. Management not presenting clear, comprehensive, concise advice. So again, without beating the horse to death, I would say that part of the job of senior management is making sure you've got quality request for decision packages that say the essence of what the issue is all about, so that when you go to vote as a councillor, you're not looking for more information unless you're anal. Council sensing it's too distant from the public. You know, you don't want that happening. You want to make sure you're connected. You want to make sure that you have opportunities to see the public. You're going to have something called the Mayor's Roundtable or Council's Forum or something on a big issue. Call everybody together, hold 3 Friday nights in a row, and you have the same issue on the table, and you get somebody to facilitate it for you. Council sensing is too distant. Council priorities are unclear. There's no focus. It's all these motherhood statements. Council, this community is in favor of the environment. Ooh, that's a brilliant statement. Have you ever seen a community in Canada that wasn't? And the answer is no. So we'll put that in. And council is in favor of having good road system. Ooh, that's another really brilliant statement. I'd include that as a goal for council. Anyway, you're still with me? It's good. Some basics. I'm going to cover them in a different way. Key roles of the mayor: you're the chair of council meetings. You're there as the senior elected leader of the community. People know that. You're the lead spokesman on community issues. People understand that. You're not the only spokesperson, but you're the lead spokesperson. You're the key liaison. You notice that's not spelled F-R-I-E-N-D, which would be friend. It's not the key friend, it's a liaison. I don't want you to be friends of. I want you to be friendly toward. You meet regularly. You develop an appreciation for the role of CAO. The mayor is an advocate of council's agenda, which is part of the mayor's agenda. So all of you get to discuss and argue it and figure out what's on first base. And the mayor speaks to the public and says, here's what we decided. The word I is not in team, so you toss that one out, and here's what we as a council decided. Key role of the mayor is to speak for council in any speeches or articles to the community. You reflect a one of. Again, it's this royal we. Represents the council, the community externally. So wherever the mayor goes, the mayor is carrying with it this image of the city. Doesn't matter whether you're out shopping, doesn't matter whether you're taking the garbage out, which is what I found out on day one. It doesn't matter where you're at. It's the first time I had somebody call me Mr. Mayor was the morning after the election, and I'm carrying out I know you'd have thought my wife would have carried out the garbage, but here I am, newly elected mayor, taking out the garbage. But in any case, I just threw that in as a bit of an aside humor. I didn't expect it. Mayor is expected to be a consensus builder. You need to hear and respect all voices, need to be fair. You know, there are people around this table, and I haven't met with some of you before. Some of your names I know from before, and some of you have now seen on your council meeting agenda packages that I streamed. But I take a look at it and I think, you know, the people around this table are people that are absolutely committed to what they're doing. They're people of respect. They're people that come at this with a completely different point of view. I can tell that by your conversations and by what you speak to. But I also recognize that you understand that at the end of the day, your own point of view goes like this, and it gets melded. And it gets melded to others. And you find out that there are people that believe as you do, others that don't. And sometimes the mayor is capable of saying, right, do we have any middle ground here? So for example, we've got two territorial governments, the Yukon and the NWT, with three of them now, and Nunavut, that all three rely on what's called consensus governance. So they take an issue and all of them go and bring it together. It's not one party versus the other, it's called consensus government. You need to hear and respect all the voices. You listen to colleagues, but you still have your own opinion. So I have kind of over the years figured out that, you know, one of the things I noticed when mayors came to my door, which they always have on election day or run up to the election, and we have our name on the front plate. I'm not sure that brings tomatoes or good friends, but in any case, the name is there. And people running for mayor have come up to the door and said hello to my wife, and they say hello to me. And I think to myself, these folks that are there are people that I recognize are going to be in office, and they're going to provide leadership to our community. And not once, since I ran for office 100 years ago, not once has any one of those people said, elect me and I'll chair a meeting. Ooh, it's interesting. Like, I think the mayor should be the leader of the community. I want to know, what are you going to lead to? How are you going to show leadership? And I challenge the people at my door, including the current mayor, who's the son of a guy that sat on my council for 12 years. I would say, what are you going to do in terms of, what are you thinking about in terms of this new major recreation complex? It's going to cost a ton of money. What are you doing? I want to know what leadership you're showing. Chair is one role, but not one person as mayor got elected because, oh, elect me and I'll be a chair. I know Robert's Rules of Order, which I think are useless for a council, but in any case, I know Robert's Rules of Order. So what? We want people that can actually lead the community in the role of mayor, and I think that's what this mayor and all mayors need to do. They need to listen to their colleagues, but also have their own opinion and be able to express it. So all of this is my wind-up to say, one of the things that I recommend looking at is your own procedure of bylaw. By the way, the Act says council shall establish its procedures for meetings. You'll notice I never use the word Roberts. That's because it's not in there. I would say you need your own procedures. Now, I'm going to give you a suggestion. A procedure that I think council should have should be that the mayor opens the discussion. The mayor says to the city manager, can you give us any further background on this topic? I know we have an RFD in front of us. Anything changed since you wrote the RFD? Anything you want to speak to? And the manager or department head speaks to the issue, so you clarified. Any questions of that? No? Do we have a motion in favor of this? And a motion is what calls the whole thing to order. Without a motion on the floor, you have no order at a meeting. So somebody says, I move. In our case, we got rid of seconders. You, I think, might still have them. But in any case, you have a motion made. And the mayor should be able to say, right, we've got the city manager here to respond to any questions. Once the questions are over with, then council's debate should start. And you should debate the topic. You're not debating management, are you? I didn't realize they were part of the debating team. So council is debating themselves. You're asking questions amongst yourselves. You need clarification? Ask the manager, and you'll probably get the clarification. But don't debate the management. When you refer a matter back, did you really think they're going to come back with a different report, with a different recommendation? I hope not. Otherwise, it means they got it all wrong in the first case. If you're using a proper committee system, you'd have sorted that one out. And then I would have the mayor sum up and then call the question. Why? Because I think the mayor is a leader. I think the community needs to hear the mayor's voice. I think the community needs to hear, are you in favor of this or not? Where are you at with this? The mayor should be able to say, we heard this on the one hand, we heard this on the other hand, and I'll be voting in favor of this. Right, oh, we got a motion on the floor, all those in favor. And you guys hit your button. All looks pretty impressive, by the way. Mayor keeps council informed on key issues. Sends stuff out immediately. Somebody does, either the mayor, the city manager, the clerk. You get up-to-date stuff. Mayor monitors relationship. If there's any angst between members of council, the mayor calls the people in and says, what's happening? Why are we having this kind of strife? And it's obviously you're on different pages. Can we get together on this? Because we need to work together as a team. The mayor leads. The mayor supports good ideas that aren't necessarily her own. The mayor advocates for the public and their public concerns, and that means you got to say, what does the broad swath of the community think as opposed to what do the two loud voices think that show up on social media, which of course doesn't reflect the overall community. It's simply the people that are participating. The mayor acts as a principal contact with other levels of government, and so the mayor goes to a meeting with the Minister of Municipal Affairs, Transportation, Environment, and the mayor takes along the deputy mayor and the city manager. City manager does the briefing on the way there and the debriefing on the way home, and the mayor and the deputy mayor or some member of council ensures that both heard the same thing, so you don't just send one person. At least that's a basic function. And the mayor performs ceremonial functions, which you kind of blow off and think, well, that's not that important until you see the people's faces when you hand out the certificate for celebrating their 50th or having a major birthday or having the volunteer firefighter or having the whatever award, and you see somebody, and I went to people's homes and here's all these plaques on the wall, some of which I signed. And I thought at the time it was no big deal. When I was mayor, I wrote a letter to every child being born in Spruce Grove. It's just something I thought of. But anyway, and I'm a writer, so I wrote a letter called Welcome to the World. Well, I got people today coming up to me and saying with their daughter or son beside them, this is the guy that wrote you that letter that's in your baby book. Anyway, why do you do that? Because the mayor's entitled to do certain special things. It's how you use the office. Generic roles of council. Councils are to respect the legislation, to understand what it says and to recognize that that legislation controls us. How are we doing for time? Have I still got a bit left? Yeah. Mayor's there to represent, the council's there to represent the public, the whole community. And again, that's trying to think through an item and say, how would the community see this? Not my community, how would the community see this? My community might be the 4 people sitting beside me at church, or the 10 people that I sit with at lunchtime, or the 12 people that I see at the Kinsman Club. That's not the community, that's a slice of the community. Council is there to establish the vision. I'll skim through some of these. Council is there to assess current policies. Is this the right policy? Do we have the right policy? Does somebody ask that question? When you have an item on the agenda, one of you should be the policy wonk that asks the question, what's the policy behind this? What policy are we talking about here? Or do we don't have a policy? Some things are a one-off, by the way. You don't need policy on everything. Some things are just done once. But if it's major and it's repetitive, either or both, you ought to have a policy. So what's the policy on this topic? Seems like a big topic to me. What's our policy? Oh, we don't have one. Well, let's decide the items tonight, but let's get management started working on the policy that's going to support this going forward. You assess current policies as a council, you resolve local issues, you arbitrate, you try to think through, you try to land on the right spot, even knowing that you're going to tick off some people in the community who may not agree with what you just decided. But that's a part of being on council, being able to stand up to somebody who's going to say, oh, you made the wrong choice, you made the wrong decision. Did I have that happen? Absolutely. What did I say? I said, look, we went through a process to get there. We had management review it. We listened to what they had to say. We made sure we went through a committee process. So we heard a slice of the public. We had a great discussion, great debate. We allowed it open for delegations. I didn't see you there, but allowed it open for delegations, and we landed. And where we landed, that's where we landed. Am I going to back up? Absolutely not. Just because somebody's going to criticize me, that's one voice out of your total population. Resolve local issues. Review the budget. Decide what makes sense. Assess the proposals. Weigh options. Set new policies. Assess ABCs, which are agencies, boards, committees. You have a string of those, and again, you need to say, what value do they add? So a couple of things that I've done. One, I did a review of city ABCs for the city of Yellowknife, I remember. Strathcona County, I remember. City of Victoria, I remember. One of the committees there, by the way, they had me go around to every committee to see what they did, who they were, I reviewed their terms of reference. I remember going to one that met at City Hall on Thursday at lunch. So I walk into the room, the guy and chairman invited me in, have a seat, George, we know why you're here, to review our committee. Whatever you do, don't get rid of us. We think we're a great committee. I said, so what's on the agenda? And they said, here it is, and they hand me this Subway sandwich. So I bite into that, and then I asked the same question again. I said, what's on the agenda? And the chair said, you're eating it. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good joke the first time, but it's not quite as funny the second time. And I said, so what's on the agenda? And he said, you're eating it. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, council established us as a committee to advise council on items referred to us by council. They've just never referred anything to us. So we meet Thursdays and have lunch. Anyway, just as a point of view, that just to make sure that you're looking at your committees to say, what value do these things actually add? And in some cases, none. In some cases, they should be motherhood into a larger committee and with a different set of terms of reference. I'm not saying you ought not to have them, by the way. I'm saying make sure they make sense. Determine best governance approach. Spent my lifetime talking about that. My views have changed somewhat, but not dramatically. Guide, encourage, listen to, assess the CAO, approve the contract, approve the position description that's within the contract, or at least make sure you approve the contract. Identify preferred accomplishments. You manage your relationship, you assess progress, you compensate fairly, all of that. And you're the only body that does that. That's it. You ought not to be part of an overall compensation structure and so on. Here's the city manager, here's everybody else. And the city manager is dealt with separately. Why? Because it's the only position that reports to you, or at least should be. Generic roles, you stay engaged in the community. Don't lose sight of what brought you to the dance. So make sure you talk to the same people you talked to before you got elected. Prepare and participate in meetings. Does everybody participate the same? No, some people talk quite a bit and other people don't talk very much, but they participate. And when they've got something to say, which I had as one counselor on my council, when I needed a really strong word of wisdom, I turned to him and said, Councillor Steiger, what do you think? You're the only person that was here when the rest of us got here. And he'd fill in the historical blank, and he was an auditor, and he would be able to share some finance background. And would he speak up? I'd ask him, why don't you speak up at every meeting or every topic? He'd say, by the time you go around the horn, which is why I started changing how I went around the horn, by the time you go around the horn and get to me, all the good points have been made. So, of course, the next meeting I started with him. Anyway, you need to forward issues to the CAO to make sure that something that comes to you, you don't know the answer, you forward it on. You either do that by a process that you as Medicine Hat would do, and other people send it to the mayor through the CAO, and it gets responded to. You propose motions, you attend meetings. There's a whole rule about how you attend meetings. I just wrote somebody yesterday about yesterday, on this report that I'm doing. What's your role as a counselor in attending ABCs? What authority do you have? Do you vote on every item? Do you bring the item back to council? What is your role? Are you an advocate for the committee? No, you're not. You're a liaison. You're an advocate for the city, which is what you do here at this table. Generic roles of the CAO, you provide the best apolitical advice you can. You identify policy options. You say you got a choice. Here's 3 things that you could do. Status quo plus 2 others. Here's the one that I recommend. and you present an argument for that. You represent the administrative organization to the council and to the community. You're a conduit of decisions down it, so you report up, you conduit information's down. You ensure effective implementation. You prepare a business plan based on council's vision. What are council's priorities? I mean, to me, it's a great irony if you have a business plan given to council and then the administration says, no, we should set the strategic priorities. I think somehow that sounds a bit off, and it is. Prepare budget proposals based on your priorities, based on what's happening today. You're not going to change a whole lot, but you're going to change some things. Typically, your capital budget is what you change. You could do an operating budget, by the way, in my view, in about 2 meetings. Now, you could take 6 months, but you could do it in 2 meetings. You could do the capital budget in the next 6 or 8 meetings. Why? Because it's a much broader suite of decisions to be made that are going to impact next year's capital or operating budget. Identify the need for new policies. It's a part of being the CAO. You're there to be the approval authority. I want to see the CAO or the city manager's signature on recommendations going to council. I want to know that everything that comes through one of your managing directors has been signed off by the city manager. Either you do that so where you actually see the signature or you see a stamp, or else she at the start of the year says, by the way, anything you get from our administration, I've approved. It's interesting. Is that the case? I'm not sure, but I remember sitting on the board of governors of NATE, the equivalent of SAIT up in Edmonton. The first meeting they had their budget presentation. So I sat there and I listened to the VP Finance and 3 people with them presenting this massive budget, millions of dollars, numbers beyond my calculations. And so eventually the question is, does the board have any questions? The chair asked that question. I'm sitting next to the president of NATE on my right-hand side, as I recall, which I totally fundamentally disagree with. But in any case, chair asked any questions, and there were a couple questions. And finally, I couldn't stand any longer, so of course I timidly put my hand up, as you might imagine. And the chair looks at me and says, you know, you're a brand new member, Mr. Cuff, but you have a question, do you? I said, yeah. I said, I want to know, what does this fellow next to me, what does he recommend? He's the president of the institute. He's the one that is our key employee. He's the one that gets paid the most amount of money. And he's sitting there looking like Pontius Pilate wiping his hands. I didn't say that, but that's what I thought. I heard nothing. What I heard from was, I said, this is not the vice president's budget. Something goes sideways, I'm not going to blame him. I'm going to blame him. Something goes wrong with your manager director's reports, it's your city manager that's accountable. That's how this system works, or at least it should. Now, she may well be talking to them in private the hour afterwards saying, how did we blow this? But that's her problem, not yours. Your problem is the city manager. Your conduit, I thought we already established this, is the city manager. That's how this works. CAO is to be a partnership builder, to build alliances, to support council's approach, to give you advice on what may be new, what's different, what's working, what isn't, assist with future vision, hire quality people, make sure you've got a good structure in place for doing that. You've got a great city here. You should be able to find quality people to work here. That shouldn't be any challenge whatsoever. This is a wonderful place to be. It needs to be sold that way. CEO and the management similarly represent the organization up to council. We've got a first-class organization, and we're the leaders of it. We provide best apolitical advice. We do the same things that the CAO does, only we do it through the CAO. Prepare the business plan, prepare budget proposals. All of this stuff takes a ton of time. And I've often said there's more blood on the floor at a management meeting around budget time than there is at council. Because managers have to fight through their own items. And they have to fight it through with people that are similarly arguing their own departments, their own divisions. And you get it to council, by the time you get it here, somebody should ask the question, what have we dropped off the table before you got it to us? What major projects did you decide to shelve before we came here? Because you're trying to manage within a 5% or 7% or whatever range you've given them. Well, I can guarantee you some things have fallen on the floor before it ever got to council. If I was a council member, I'd be saying, what were the top 3 items that you fought over before you dropped them off the table? And we might decide we want to fund them. You're there to identify the need for new policies, review current policies, what works. Well, you can tell that management looks at each other when something's going off the tracks at a council meeting. And one of the things going through their head is, how did we get this wrong? One of the things they're talking to each other about afterwards is, why did we stick with that policy and it's obviously not working? We've got council dumping all over it. They may not even use the word policy, but we know as managers what's behind all of this. And we need to be open to change. As senior management, we review the value of our ABCs. As management, we look at these things and say they take up time and energy. We may have staff attending each of them. I'm not sure you do that here, but in some places they do. And they've got people attending your boards and committees. Well, that takes up time and money. You're there to support council's approach, assist council in developing the vision, respond to local issues, hire quality people. It's kind of like the iceberg. You folks see the top 10%, and the 90% is what they see on a day-to-day basis. And that's the way this should work. They hire quality people, and they champion the administration in front of council. They stand up and say, we got quality people, knowing that somebody just dropped the ball. They will be attending to that the day after. You don't have to worry about that one. They know what happened. They know where the problem was. They'll be looking at that. I got called in by the city of Regina and by something called the Regina Exhibition Association. It's called REAL, Regina Exhibition Association Limited. Some of you will recall the issue of the day was their use of bad slogans, not your grandma's Regina, all of that kind of stuff. The city that rhymes with fun. There was a whole bunch of stuff that ended up on the front page and that ticked off all of the kind folks of Regina, and it hit the headlines across not only Canada, but also was on Fox and on CNN. And so they called me in to investigate what happened, what went wrong. You know, the one thing I never did is I never identified who hit the send button when they shouldn't have, because that's what happened. At the end of a management meeting with all these ideas had been compiled and all this stuff had hit the whiteboard and everybody came up with all these wonderful ideas, everybody knew some of those shouldn't go anywhere. But the junior person didn't. And the junior person hit the send button. And that send button got a front page news the next day. Well, they were celebrating this new messaging and stuff on behalf of tourism and so economic development, all this stuff wrapped in. That wasn't celebrated the day after. What was celebrated was the fact that this went sideways. So I talked about process. What got us to that point? Who approves overall? Who was supposed to be at the table monitoring this? It's not the junior person that's going to get, in my opinion, that's not where the problem lies. That's not called accountability. You can deal with that internally. The problem is, where did it start? Similarly here, the management team looks and says, something went off the tracks. Now, we can use it as a teachable moment, but geez, Henry Ford was once asked, are you going to fire the guy that just cost you $10,000 because the whole assembly line shut down? It was his mistake, and Ford said, I just spent $10,000 on his education. Why would I fire him? It's a good answer. They're there to champion administration. So those are some of the basics. I've done this in 2 hours. Normally I take 8 because they tell a whole lot more stories, anecdotes, fluff up, whatever. Tell people how impressive I've been in various organizations, a lot of which is gilding the lily. But in any case, I would respond to any questions you have, and I know we have a follow-up session later. So I expect to have you all there later. Any questions?
So we have Mayor Clark and Councillor Knodel.
Thank you, Mr. Cuff. It's nice to see you again.
You?
So there's lots of things in there that I agree with, but I think, you know, as we've discussed, I don't agree with everything
Right.
of this model. One of the things that I particularly struggle with is, so the MGA assigns development and evaluation of policy and programs to council, and implementation of policy and programs to the city manager.
It's true.
But what I hear you say, and in your investigation report for Chestermere, you outline this as well. I just skimmed it, so I apologize if I'm misstating it. But that in fact, despite the MGA, our enabling legislation saying that council is responsible for developing and evaluating policy, that's actually administration's job, and so it's illegal for council to do it.
Yeah, I would argue that that's not totally true. I would argue that there's 2 roles to be played. I think council is the body that, in my view, establishes policy. I would argue that council, in my view, is the body that approves programs because you do that through the budget process. I would argue that management should be reviewing policy, and they should be reviewing the impact of policy on a whole variety of things. And then they realize, geez, something's going off the tracks, and they track it back, and they find out the thing that went off the tracks is we've got the wrong policy. We need to tweak it, we need to change it, we need to rescind it. And I would expect your management to come back to council and say, we need to change policy based on the following 5 things, or whatever. So I think you both play a role with regard to policy. At the ultimate, though, which I would never change saying, at the ultimate, council approves policy. Management, in my view, does not approve policy, which is why I'm opposed to the words management policy, because I think it confuses people. I realize there's, quote, management policy. I just think we ought to be calling it what it is, which is a managerial directive under a council policy.
I don't disagree with that last part. My question is, though, the MGA doesn't say that council approves policy, although we do. It does say that in other parts, but it's that we develop and we evaluate and administration implements. To me, that's a very clear line, and it's consistent with how other levels of government work. And so that, to me, is a division that this, like the policy development, the fact that council or, for example, a minister, whatever, might bring a private member's bill forward,
Yep.
that is council's role according to the MGA.
Yeah, and I'm not taking exception with that. I'm saying it's a question of how you define developing policy. Council can develop policy through your discussion in various committee meetings, which is often where it comes from. You can develop policy through your discussions as a council, and you say to the administration, right, based on the discussion we've had, it's obvious that we need either a new policy or a policy altogether. And would you please, based on our discussions, based on our committee review, start the development of the policy, because I don't expect council to be sitting here for hours on end arguing over the dotting the i's and crossing the t's, trying to write their policy. Because if you have council involved in the word developing, if you see council doing it themselves, writing the policy, you're going to have 9 opinions on the policy, and then you need to look for a process to pull that together so it all makes sense. So I think we're, to some extent, that might be splitting hairs. At the end of the day, who has the authority to approve or not approve? And the answer is council.
I do think it's significant. 9 people could disagree on a policy
Right.
that administration brought forward too. I do think it's a significant role of government to, for example, if I feel strongly about a bylaw or something like that, there's lots of ways that it's actually not that complicated to. One amazing example would be chickens. Some people really want chickens in their backyard. There's loads and loads examples of pilot projects. It's not that difficult to pull one, bring it to council and say, this is the policy that I'm putting forward for, or the bylaw I'm putting forward for our approval. So each councillor could, is our duty, participate generally in the development and evaluation of policy. So you're not saying that that's illegal?
I'm not saying it's illegal.
Okay.
I am saying that there's a fundamental flaw, because you've got 9 councillors, all of whom are now at home writing up a policy on chickens, and whether or not the municipality allows 1 or more chickens in the backyard, and whether or not you can build a coop of whatever size and dimension so it's not overlooking the neighbor's illegal suite or whatever. And so you've got people writing the policy, and you've got 9 of you applying your brains to the policy, and you all come up with a different, quote, policy. So where does that put you? Well, it puts you in a mess, because you're now trying to figure out what's our policy in terms of, does the city tolerate or allow chickens in the backyard or any part of the property? Well, that's a good question, and it is a good question. Question is, who's going to put together the essence of that? Well, preferably somebody that's had some experience around bylaws, preferably somebody that's had some experience and ability to do the research around what's worked in other municipalities across Canada, given the fact that you're largely, as a council, in an honoraria position except the mayor. So who has the time to go and research this? Typically, your management does. Who's going to put it together in a bylaw format so that it gets approved by your city solicitor and outside legal counsel? Your management does. What is council going to see? They're going to see 1 or 2 or 3 options, hopefully, because I never believe in one option, by the way. I think there's a status quo and there's an option to do it somewhat differently. So it's a more question of what role do we see management playing in that? I see management doing the background work, doing the research, I see management crafting the policy. I see management bringing it forward and the city manager saying, this was council's debate and discussion. You wanted us to review a policy on this. We don't have a policy. We've crafted something and I'm recommending it for council's consideration. Council dives in, or you refer it to a committee, you have a much more in-depth review, and by and large, there's changes made, and back it comes to council, and council endorses the policy, or council changes it. All of that, by the way, has to have council's imprint on it, or it's not City of Medicine Hat policy. It's somebody else's ideas inside administration. I happen to think they do a lot of valuable background research work that councils typically don't have the time or the stomach for, and any desire to get involved in the details. And you've got people in the clerk's office or the solicitor's office going to find out what's best practice elsewhere. And they know that the management of other cities is going to respond to them very quickly. And they also know that if they get a call from a council member, that typically the management of another community calls back the city solicitor and says, one of your councilors just called us about da-da-da-da-da. Are you aware of that? What's going on in your city that you're the one that's not contacting us to get the background? I mean, there's a whole bunch of this stuff that's gone on for years. And it's simply saying, what role do we play? You know, if I came here and you said to me, George, we've got management doing stuff that is not according to council-approved policy, I would be concerned about that. And I've been invited in when that's the case, where management has been involved in, I mean, you don't have to look any further than the Chestermere report, where management has been kicked out of the system, and you've got council members that are getting themselves involved in administrivia. Well, completely inappropriate. Why? Because staff are not going to say no to a councillor. They're certainly not going to say no to the mayor, but they could say no to their department head. So you've got a whole structural imbalance, a whole power imbalance that happens between council and management and so on. I think we need an appreciation of what it is they do. And at the end of the day, they put their best foot forward and say, here's our recommended policy. And you as a mayor and council say, we don't think so. We're going to go this direction. I tell you, one of the ways you can do that is you can come to council, depending on your procedure bylaw, you can come to council and put an item on the table and say, I move. You've now forced council to discuss the item that you're recommending. Sometimes called notice of motion, but you're the one that's crafted it. You're the one that's come up with the idea. But typically a council will say, well, that looks like it makes some sense, but sometimes something that looks really good on the surface isn't all that great underneath. So maybe we ought to have management take a look and see what's the downside of what you just recommended. Well, that's what we rely on management to do. So I'm not sure I'm saying anything particularly illuminating or contrary, other than I'm saying there's two significant roles there. One of which is policy decision-making, and one of which is policy advice. And you need somebody that's doing the research and advising and saying, based on what we think is best practice, this is what we recommend. Now, you can do something different. And quite frankly, if council decides against the city manager's recommendation, I say to councils, by the way, across Canada, the city managers should be right on their recommendations about 7, maybe 8 times out of 10. And they look at me and I think, well, why is that? I said, well, the other 2 or 3 times out of 10, council is going to go a different direction and going to decide something entirely different. Well, does that make the city manager wrong? No, actually, the city manager's recommendation is good administratively, but politically, you decided to go a different direction. And when you think about it, hitting 7 out of 10 is double the average of guys in the Major Baseball League. They're getting paid millions to hit 350. So city manager is doing pretty well, 7 recommendations out of 10 that get approved. I'm saying that's all it is. It's her, in this case, recommendation based on the folks behind her feeding up information, having the argument at a council or administrative table, and saying this is what we ought to present. And I'll guarantee you they've had that discussion before it gets to you, or at least it should be happening.
I'm certain that it does. I have been part of those conversations. It is vetted. It's just the driving force behind. So I understand what you're saying.
You can lead a policy, Madam Mayor. You can lead it. You can say, we don't have a policy on check-ins, whatever, fill in the blank. And you can do that. I would argue you ought to do that at a council committee of the whole meeting, which, again, as I said, I would change your format, but I would do that at a council committee of the whole meeting and say, this is an item I think we need some research on, some background on, and I think we need a policy on it. And as long as your colleagues say hallelujah and amen, off it goes. And back it comes 2 months later, a month later, and you've got a new draft policy that's been put together, and you think, that's pretty good. You know, they've done a bunch of research, there's All the areas have been covered. We're now ready for a political discussion, which they ought not to be a part of.
Right. It would be very rare, I think, for someone to just say, we need a policy on X. I think they would have ideas about what they want in the policy. But the other two things, if you don't mind,
I'll try not to answer quite as lengthy, but anyway, go ahead.
the how of things, you're saying that's not our purview. And in most cases, the vast majority of cases, I have no interest in what kind of gravel we're using or, unless it becomes, people are sinking into the ground because
Yep.
of the gravel. And then
Yep.
we would maybe have a role in that. But a lot of times the how is very important.
Absolutely.
For example, transit. We can agree, we all want transit, but how we deliver transit is the important part. So, you could have anything from like public, private, one route that only goes once per day. The how is the transit system, and it is the
And the what
success.
is the fact that you want a good first-class transit system, and you say to your management, we're not sure we're getting it now. We need to take an overall look at transit. We want you folks to take a look at transit and bring back to us what is the essence of the transit system that we have, and where do you think it's falling apart, and where do you think we're succeeding? So the what is our transit system. The how we're doing transit, I don't expect to decide what bus route goes where. I don't happen to decide how they manage the fleet and the garages. I don't happen to know whether or not they use winter tires or they use the same tires year round. All of that kind of stuff is in the how envelope, and I could care less. I want to know we've got a first-class transit system that offers transit for the handy bus system, for the people locked in, for the whatever, and we got a whole bunch of folks that need this system. I want to make sure that the what is that we've got a really good transit system, that I can stand up at a pulpit and say, this is first-class transit for our people. We cover over all of the basic needs of our community. And we've got management working on it on a daily basis, doing the head counts, doing the whatever route checks and all that kind of stuff. That's a management purview. They've got staff doing all of that stuff. I'm trying to say to you as a council that you're going to absolutely fall apart. If you dive in and do this big dive into detail, you're going to lose. You're going to be absolutely focused on detail to the point of no return. And you've got somebody who's still trying to provide direction for the city. You got to ask yourself every now and again, who's actually directing this show here? And the answer is mayor and council. And if you're not, I'll guarantee you somebody is.
But getting into the minutia of implementation is not what I was talking about. And so
Right.
if we take something to a ridiculous extreme, it will always be ridiculous. But I think there's a in between where the how should be council's purview.
Well, and some of it does. I'm not trying to be overly simplistic. Some of it, you do look at the how of a particular system. How do we actually deliver good transit? Well, some of that comes up to you in a transit report, so you get to look at the quote how. I'm saying, where's your primary focus? Primary focus answers the question, what? What's our policy with regard to city transportation? Where our policy is that we provide a first-class transit system for those that would rely on transit because they don't drive automobiles, they can't, they're housebound, whatever. We also are doing it for the purpose of our own way of trying to monitor climate, trying to ensure that we're doing something proper in terms of roadway maintenance. All of that becomes part of your rationale for your good policy. But you get to ask, how are we actually going about doing this? I guess it's a question, Madam Mayor, of, where's the cutoff? And unfortunately, I've dealt with councils where they know no cutoff. They go deep diving into whatever. And it's the old joke in rural Alberta was you could tell who's in charge of public works by the number of miles the grader went with the blade up. And that's what happens. We've got councils jumping in on stuff that, I watched a council meeting on our community TV not that long ago, and a council member, they were talking about the pipes, the underground pipe system, and the councillor says, yeah, I probably shouldn't be particularly interested in this and probably don't need to be knowledgeable, but how deep does a pipe have to be? Anyway, it was at about that stage I was looking for another channel. It was like being in Victoria, and they were discussing how long the widgets were that were holding up the Johnson Street Bridge, and I said to my wife, remind us not to go over the Johnson Street Bridge. There are things you ought to be involved in doing, and there's a lot of them. And my concern with administrations right across Canada, and I've said this in front of them, is that they do a very poor job of orienting their council in terms of their role. Because I think councils have a lot of roles in this community, and I'm not entirely sure that you're properly oriented to what those roles are. And as a result of that, what do you dive into? Like, I looked at your last orientation, and I'm not going to dissect it, but I look at how many pages are spent on the city manager's office, which was held by a different person than the person today. How many pages are spent describing the city manager, and how many pages are spent describing council governance? Pretty simple. I look at my session that I did in Muskoka. I asked them to give me a copy of the orientation package before I got there. So I get to the motel, I fly into Toronto, drive up to Muskoka region, get into the hotel. Before I go to dinner, I get this package at the front desk as I'd asked for. Here's the orientation, Mr. Cuff, for your new council for around the region. I take it with me to dinner and I look through it. I just take a moment to share this with you. Front page, nice picture of the Muskoka area, beautiful area. Second page, welcome from the mayor of the day. Third page, a fact sheet, all of which I thought looked pretty good. Page 4 is a blank page. In the middle it says corporate services. Just substitute whatever the name is here. And the next 15 pages, it was about corporate services, finance, risk management, IT, HR, whatever. The next blank page said operational services. And the next 15 pages was all the hard services. Next page is planning development services. Next 15 pages, all the planning services and the laws and so on. Last page is preventive services, all the stuff in fire and bylaw and da-da-da-da-da. And the last 10 or 15 pages was the procedure bylaw. I said this in front of a crowd of 500. I said, does anybody remember me using the word governance? No. Why not? Because it wasn't there. I asked for the package you used to orient your council to its role. Well, your role is governance. But all they oriented you to is how to become management. And I think we start off on the wrong page. We invite our councils into how do we manage. Well, isn't this fascinating? I want to become Dennis. I want to become Mr. Stoff. I want to become, oh, no, I don't. That's not what I got elected to do. If I wanted to be one of them, I lined up at the wrong wicket. That's the problem. Fundamentally, it's the problem. We need to be able to say to a council, if you're doing this, you'd run the whole system. Who gets to approve the operating budget? Council. Who gets to approve the capital budget? Council. Who gets to approve every bylaw you've ever had in the city of Medicine Hat? Council. Who gets to approve every policy? Council. Who gets to approve the hiring and firing of the CAO, the city manager? Council. Who gets to approve the compensation plan for the city manager? Council. Tell me one big thing that you do and I'll tell you who does it. It's council. Now, within that, there's a whole truckload. 90% of everything else is done by your administration, as it should be. But somebody's got to set the tone at the top, and that happens to be you. I just think you get yourselves buried. Absolutely buried in detail.
I am not talking about that level of detail. I used the example of transit and said the size of the gravel wasn't what I was talking about. So it is that gray area that I was talking about.
Okay.
I also was curious about your comparison or your use of the example of a board
Right.
as analogous to us rather than a government. So the
I can use
gaming and
government too,
liquor,
but
the
I
gaming and liquor board, the way that operates,
Yeah.
they are not elected. They report to an elected person.
Yeah, and the
But I
elected
think-
body happens to have a minister of, in their case, Solicitor General or whatever it was at the time, and below that is called the deputy minister. And the minister takes forward to the legislature a policy paper that's often reduced to 2 pages, by and large it is, and everything below that is handled by the deputy minister and their administration. Same in municipal affairs. I've worked for a whole bunch of departments. I know how this works. They rely on a senior deputy to do the administration of the organization. The policy maker and the policy person that has to defend it in front of the public is the cabinet and the deputy and the minister of that particular department. So if it's AGLC, there's a minister that has to defend it. I understand that.
So I just want to finish the thought. So you, in what you've just said, you would say that we are analogous to the Alberta government or the federal government rather than a board.
Yeah, I would say because you're a governing body, you're analogous to other governing bodies, and I think that means you've got a very rarefied atmosphere. There are very few people in Canada that get elected to provide governance. You're one of them. You're not the Chamber of Commerce, you're not the Kinsman Club, you're a governing body. I understand that.
But the significant part that I'm trying to get to is that we're elected and therefore accountable to the public, whereas
Exactly.
in a board situation,
Yeah,
the board doesn't have that level of accountability to the public. And so in the Carver model, or whatever you're calling this, in an elected situation, as the mayor, I am the most accountable.
Yep.
And I'm perfectly happy to be accountable for things that I do and have control over. And even, if this council decides something, I understand that it's my role to, now that's what we're doing, and
Right.
we just have to move on. But when I don't have any control over things, it's not great having to be accountable for those
yeah.
things.
It's tough having a big swallow because at the end of the term, everything big, everything significant that happened in those 4 years, the public would associate with you. They would say, this is on your term, on your watch, you're accountable. I understand that. I also understand the same thing applies to cabinet ministers, that there is 95 to 99% of what goes on in that Parks Department, 5,000 employees, that the minister does not see. The minister understands parks policy at a very high level. And I would argue that that's about where it stops. Even the lower level policies, ministers wouldn't see that. Deputy ministers might, ADMs would. That's how the system works. They delegate the power and authority down, and they say we hire quality people around those policies. And they recommend the change, the minister brings it to cabinet, and then the minister defends it on the floor. That's typically how the system works.
So are you suggesting, or would you say that what you've outlined for us is consistent with how the provincial government operates?
No, I think there's a lot of differences, Madam Mayor. And by the way, I'm not a proponent of Carver, so whatever anybody says, please don't put that on me. I'm a proponent of the Medicine Hat system of governance. I'm a proponent of the Olds College model of governance. I'm not a proponent of any model of governance that takes all of the authority and puts it in the hands of the CEO and says, you have to report on the ends and everything else you look after, which is a Carver model. I don't want to reduce it to that, but that's essentially what's wrong with the model, in my opinion. You are a body that's invested in governance. You're a body that asks questions around governance. You're a body that actually meets with your management on a bi-weekly basis, sometimes weekly.
Okay,
You're a lot more tied to it.
thank you. Just one last point, and I don't think that it'll be contentious, but I do always like to point out, because it's a pet peeve of mine, is that the one employee thing is not from the MGA. That's just a preference that you have.
Yeah, one employee thing is definitely not from the MGA, because it says you can hire a CAO or CAOs, and having talked to the ministry and their senior people on a regular basis, I know they wish that had never shown up, and they have some ideas about why it did. And actually, Medicine Hat might lie at the core of some of that, because at one point you had a COO of energy and a CAO of public services, and so you might have had a bigger impact on the MGA than you thought you did. But if you ask them what system makes sense, they're the ones that endorsed my report. They're the ones that hired me as opposed to any other of the 100 consultants to do the report, and they know that that's how the system works best across Canada. They know that having one person in charge of makes a whole lot more sense than council trying to become a management body rather than a council. So I could defend that 100 times to 1, and I would be on very firm ground.
Okay, and there's designated officers as well. I thank you.
Thank you. We have 3 other councilors with questions, and Councilor Knodel is up, so go ahead.
Thank you, Councillor McGrogan. Through Councillor McGrogan to Mr. Cuff, thank you for being here. I just have, this should be quick. I'm just looking for some different strategies and this is probably just twofold. I'm probably gonna answer my question as I'm asking it, but a notice of motion versus a spontaneous motion coming to the table. We have a bit of a unwritten norm that we should have a notice of motion to better prepare other councillors. But is there pros and cons to proposing a motion kind of on the fly? Do you see value in that? Do you think that having a notice of motion with some background information is more fruitful for the group? Can you give your perspective on that?
Yeah, I would give you, I'm a person with examples, so I'll give you a quick example. When I first got elected, election night, we actually got sworn in, we had a part of a council meeting. And at the council meeting, we had a delegation. The delegation came in and they presented a particular thesis and said, we want council to endorse. Well, I couldn't believe that the previous council hadn't already endorsed this. And I asked the colleagues around the table, and I asked them for their comment on this proposal, and somebody said, so moved, and we all nodded our heads, and we voted 6-1. You'll note that the one that didn't vote in favor was the guy that was on the previous council, because he knew how foolish we were about to look. But in any case, I get home that night still involved in self-flagellation because I was commending myself so much for running a good meeting, that I got a wake-up call in the morning when somebody phoned me and said, yeah, but, and said, do you realize how foolish you looked last night? I said, how's that? They said, that delegation. I said, what was wrong with that? We made a decision. We're a decisive body. No, I said, you know, what you were shown was a coin. And the funny thing about a coin is that it has two sides. And you just saw side one. And there were 3 points on side one, and you went with it, and you approved it. On side two, which the delegation knew about, because they actually prepared, whereas we didn't, because that's the first time we heard about the item, was the other 3 points that were totally contrary to what we just heard. He said, you dropped the ball, Mr. Mayor. And I went back to council and created the very first cuffism, which was first heard, deferred. And therein lies the reason why you ought not to have spontaneous motions, because even though they sound like they make good sense, I'd be running them by the clerk's department to say, where are we stepping on the whatever that we're not aware of until after we've stepped on it. So I think notice of motion to me makes sense, because most cases it's not Rome's burning, we need to pass the hose. In most cases, there's a bit of a time lag, and we could actually have it looked into with quality people knowing what they're doing rather than us winging it. So, yeah, I'm all in favor of a notice of motion. Or simply raising the point and having a system that allows administration to pick up on your point you're making and saying, we'll take that and develop a report on it. We'll come back to the next meeting of council. I'm not quite as supportive of notice of motion as it might sound, because I think sometimes administration can simply say, we'll look into that and get back to council.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Robbins has a question.
Yes, thank you, and through the chair, thank you, Mr. Cuff. What you've described of orientation was exactly what we had here, which is, I think we were handed your book. That was all the governance training that we received. And then we got the departments gave us information about, which was very helpful, like, don't get me wrong, to understand how each department worked and how the reporting structure and what the committees were about was really valuable. But we ended up attending, a few of us, if not all of us, governance session with you very early on. And this sort of halfway check-in, I think I would have liked it quite a few months ago, so I'm grateful you're here today, because it has affirmed a lot of my thoughts about sort of what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I've made a couple of notes of things to follow up. Sorry. So you want to be on council and a presentation about that to potential councillors, great idea. That's, I hope we could work something out to make that happen. And I also made a note of moving seats around the table. I think, not that I don't like my neighbors, but I think it would be helpful to move around and sort of, you hear things differently when you're looking at some. I never really get to look at these two, but I get to look over there a lot, and when you see facial expression in addition to the context of what they're saying, it is really valuable. So I appreciate that you brought that up, looking at us here, that may be valuable. So thank you for those things. But my question is this. So you've done reports on dysfunctional and broken councils before. And so I'm wondering, in your experience, were they able to repair what was broken? And how did they do that successfully?
You know, that's a really good question. I say that as a consultant because you always try to find a way to delay thinking. That's a really good question. I'm not entirely sure I've ever been asked that before, but I have a really good track record of my recommendations being accepted. So does that mean that there's significant overnight change? I'd say probably not. Because people are people. So in some cases I get called in because there's a major Donnybrook between two members of council, and they're asking me to be the referee and to try to figure out where does the right side lie, if there is one. And sometimes it's in terms of the mayor, and the mayor having decided that they have far more power and clout than they thought they have less power and clout than they thought they had. And sometimes it's me trying to point that out, both in a report as well as in some private counseling, which in fact, today on the way down here was asked to do some private counseling with the mayor who's struggling in terms of in a good-sized community, how do I chair meetings more effectively because this isn't working? And a lot of it becomes angst within council because the mayor is stumbling over how do I chair a meeting, because I really want to get involved in the discussion, but I'm told I can't, I've got to chair the meeting. That's my point. But anyway, I think there are councils that pick up on it really quickly. I've had any number of councils that have adopted my model of Governance and Priorities Committee and got rid of this whole committee of the whole idea, which, by the way, a Governance and Priorities Committee it's just terms of reference say you focus on the top items. You don't focus on the whole blinking agenda, because all that does is it launders the meeting in a pre-meeting, and then you come to council and you've already decided what you're going to do. I think most of the agenda should come to council. What shouldn't, and should go to a committee of the whole called GPC, should be the top 4 items, the top 3 items that the mayor knows, the deputy mayor knows, the CAO knows, that these are the issues that are going to be the ones that grab council. So let's make sure we've had a good discussion around it. And let's do it through a Governance Priorities Committee with perhaps the chair rotates and so on. There are a whole variety of terms of reference that I could send to you. Anyway, I just think that there are better ways of doing what you could do. You can look around. I could point you to some places that I think have got a better handle on it than others, and some that have allowed themselves to just get trapped into personality politics. I'd almost prefer that people would face downward when they're at a council meeting rather than looking across the table, because often when you look across the table, you're making a judgment based on who's giving the point of view. And you ought not to do that. You ought to make a judgment on the text, on the thesis of what they're saying, rather than who's saying it.
Thank you. Councillor Hyder has a question.
Thank you, and through the chair, good evening, Mr. Cuff. First of all, I'll just quickly say I'm truly grateful you're here, and I do enjoy your humor, so if I laugh too loud, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to our discussion later this evening, so I'll make it quick. First of all, thank you for being here, and I'm just speaking on behalf of Councillor Hirsch, who had to leave. He would like to pass on his regrets for leaving early. It's he and his wife's 31st anniversary, and if I want to see 32, I need to attend a dinner. He said, I appreciate you coming and note your work with Olds College, and Dr. Tom Thompson was a member for me in the governance. So that's from Darren.
Thank you.
Thank you.
He ought to be dismissed from council if he's not here tonight, but in any case, it's something small like a 31st wedding anniversary. Yeah.
He just left, so he tried his best. Mayor
Why
Clark.
would you want to celebrate your 32nd? But in any case, go ahead.
I think we can all agree that Councillor Hirsch's marriage is of utmost importance to all of us.
I agree
so.
with that.
Emails. So from my perspective, if something is council business at all, it should be dealt with at a council meeting. I think to a certain extent, habits can kind of develop of doing things over email rather than doing things at council meetings. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that. One of the main things is that, you know, sometimes emails will come out and respond by the end of the day, or all of these discussions are happening and it's really hard to keep up with because it's just an email conversation that you might not get to till later on. And also, this is where that is supposed to happen, I think. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I'll just sum up with this. I have an absolute fundamental belief that council has a very, very important role to play. I also have a fundamental belief that all of this can get watered away, there's other expressions, by doing your governance over email, over text, in the parking lot, in the hallways, lobbies, whatever. Governance should be done here. Decision-making should be done here. It should be visible to your public to see, regardless of how messy it is. That's never the point. The point is governance should happen here. And I'm absolutely fundamentally opposed to people deciding things over email and text. I'm actually opposed to the fact that people in council can phone each other and say, item A5 on the agenda, do I have your support? I would be saying back to the person, how on earth would I know? All I've read is the issue so far, and I heard you phone call me or text me. Do you have my support? Well, how on earth would I answer that? There's 8 other people or 7 other people I've got to hear from yet before I could give you an answer. It's called council. And besides which, we haven't heard from our administration yet, and that's another source of good information. So how would I commit my vote to you in advance of having the information that I need to have and the debate at council? Why not we just mail in our votes and save a whole lot of honorarium? You know, to me, there's some fundamentals to this, and people lose track of it, and they get brain weary, I think, and they get lazy, and they do stuff by email and do stuff by text, and then they can't spell, and then you got to figure out what does all that mean if you're dealing with my granddaughters, you know, all of that. And you think, why can't we get this straight? Why can't we figure out a certain process and stick with it? This is the ultimate of council. This is the legislature. Whatever else happens, it should end up here. Not being decided by somebody sending an email saying this is the way we do things. Now, you know, if I want to challenge it, I should be able to challenge that.
Right, and I do agree with that.
Respectfully.
Would you also say it's best practice that if council is receiving information, for example, like, you know, this issue is or maybe somebody asks a question in council, and as you said, administration says, we'll report back on that. That, in my view, all of that information in the CAO report, that should be in an agenda package, regardless of whether it's also emailed out. Like sometimes these things are time sensitive and we need to, and I would never suggest that it's out of laziness.
Part of this is to get away from the 904-page report, but I must say management has a responsibility to manage information. And that means taking a complex, convoluted story and process and everything else and rolling that up into a maximum, of, in my view, 3 pages, which is 2 more than most deputy ministers are given by the minister, and I know that. And so they're expected to put everything into 3 pages that says, what's the issue? What's the backdrop to this issue? What are the pros and cons to this issue? What are the 2 or 3 options to this issue? And which one do we actually recommend? And you try to do the 2 or 3 options clearly and without bias, i.e. don't sell one and downplay the other 2. Say, here's the good and the bad of those 3 options. Based on our experience collectively around our table, we recommend this. And I expect management, the CAO, the city manager, to stand behind this. But I expect to know that behind it, now some of you are more anal than others, and you want to see what's behind that door, then put the links on the bottom of the 3rd page, and somebody who's interested can go diving down into all of the links. Fine by me, I just don't want that as a part of an agenda package, because otherwise you're trying to make librarians out of everybody, and they didn't plan to be a librarian, they planned to be a decision maker.
Yeah, I apologize if I wasn't clear. I agree with the decision-making needs to come here, but just, I can't remember like something that was the last thing that, you know, someone would have thrown out. This is what is going on in the community, or I've heard. I just want to confirm whether that's true or not. It's not about a decision, but I think my question is, I would say it's best practice for that to come to this council, because regardless of whether it's a 900-page briefing or 900 emails in your inbox, it's still stuff we have to read, right?
And if it's a community issue, Madam Mayor, if it's a big enough issue, I would argue that it should be on an agenda. If it's the arena opens at 6, it's not an agenda item. Everybody knows that. So it's more of is this an informational item or is this a council agenda package? And I think somebody has to be monitoring that, and it's called the clerk, supported by the CAO. So the clerk has got to have their head around, are these issues that need to come to council? Or are these issues that are already game, set, and match, and we just need to advise everybody?
So it's the information items I'm talking about.
Yeah, the information items should be put into an information package. That should be part of your consent agenda, and you'll say all those in favor of the 14 items on the consent agenda, thanks very much, next. And you can unload a whole bunch of stuff off the agenda because you've all read it. All you need to do is read it. Here's a letter from the minister of whatever. It doesn't particularly apply to us, but we want to make sure you got it, so you can't say that we held it back.
Well, it looks like there's no more questions. I really wanted to delve into your mind about Bill 20, but I think we'll have to save that for another time. Yeah, so maybe over supper we could hear your opinion on some of that legislation.
I still want to eat.
Yes. Anyway, on behalf of council, Mayor, if you had something you wanted to say, but thank you so much. Thanks to the community members that showed up today to listen to Mr. Cuff and glean his wisdom. And I found it extremely valuable to get our purpose back on track. And I think it is easy to start digging down, digging trenches into things that we don't need to be in. So well reminded. On behalf of council, thank you.
Thank you.
Through the chair, I'll make a
So I-
motion to go into recess until closed, until we have our closed meeting at 7 PM.
I'll second that.
All in favor? Just a show of hands, I think, if we do. Looks like it's unanimous.